Hello, and welcome to the Identity Paradox Inside the Racial Pharmacon, a podcast examining anti-racist theories and practices aimed at dismantling destructive identitarian politics and ideologies, both in the US and abroad. Please note that discussions deal with very difficult subject matter, so every episode comes with a general content warning.
And I'm your host, Carlos Gallego, Associate Professor of English, as well as both Distinguished Teaching Professor in the Humanities here at St. Olaf College. This podcast is part of the programming brought to you by the Bolt Chair Endowment, so special thanks to the Bolt family for making this programming possible. If you enjoyed today's podcast, make sure to subscribe for future episodes. And now, the show. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Identity Paradox. I'm your host, Carlos Gallego, and this is part 2 of episode 7, I think. We're coming to you from downtown Minneapolis on Monday, February 21st. As I said, this is part 2 of a two-part episode on convergence theory, which is the idea of a left and right-wing extremes meeting on certain political issues, where we will be talking about how that model doesn't necessarily apply to the United States and what the fascist creep is again, and how that can occur specifically within left-wing movements in the United States and around the world historically, and whether or not that is what's taking place in this country at the moment regarding things like cancel culture and culture wars and other things that were spoken about in part 1 of this episode. So today we're going to kind of summarize briefly what convergence theory is, how that applies to current U.S. politics, and more importantly, talk about what to do about that and whether or not, if there is such a thing as a convergence in this country, i.e. there is a type of left fascism, what does that look like, and what are the systems and forms of politics that enable that. But before we begin, again, this is, we're coming to you from downtown Minneapolis on Monday, February 21st. The reason I want to say that is because this is a heartfelt condolences and solidarity with our comrades in Portland over the mass shooting that took place this weekend. They were, our comrades in Portland were organizing protests against police violence in honor of Amir Locke, who was murdered here in Minneapolis during the no-knock warrants, and we'll talk about that later in this episode. But people were shot at before the protest or the demonstration even began, and someone died and several people were injured. And Portland is a city that engages in very direct action type politics. And this is not surprising considering the ironic convergence in the Northwest of anti-fascist and pro-white nationalists and white supremacist groups. And it seems that this specific individual possibly involved in this murder / mass shooting was perhaps affiliated, or if not following, some of these extremist right-wing groups. So our hearts go out to our comrades in Portland. We are in solidarity with you here in Minneapolis, and we will continue to do so as long as we're fighting for social justice. So I just wanted to start the episode with that brief note. It's very tragic and sad that this is happening across the country, but it's also, I think, indicative of not only our historical moment in terms of geopolitics. There's also the Russia thing going on right now in the Ukraine, but it's also indicative, I think, of failing systems that need to be either completely done away with, and we need new systems of social organization to take their place, or they need some radical reform. And those will be some of the things that we'll be talking about in this episode, whether or not they're taking place, if so where, if they're failing or succeeding, and what possible next steps could we take as a nation and as a people in order to achieve things like social justice. So in order to just begin, I want to review briefly what convergence theory is. So here's a graphic of the horseshoe model that I discussed in part 1 of this episode. And as you can see, it's literally a horseshoe with the right side kind of highlighting the far right versus, or extreme right versus your kind of conventional right, the centrist. And on the left side of the horseshoe, you have the conventional kind of mainstream leftist, and then you have someone who would be considered far left. So the convergence, as I already stated in the mini intro, I guess unintentionally to this episode, is when supposedly the left and right parts of the horseshoe meet, right? So there's some convergence, some overlap, some point of intersection, if you will, between the politics of the far right and their extremist kind of fascist totalitarian tendencies and certain kind of politics on the left that encourage similar types of kind of totalitarian fascist mindsets, and whether or not that convergence actually takes place, A, and B, if it's taking place in the United States, and then C, if it is taking place, what exactly that looks like. So this next graph kind of highlights what it would be, what current US politics would look like in terms of this centrist model, or of this horseshoe model, sorry. And as you can see, President Biden is in the middle as a centrist. I think I described this or talked about this in part 1 of this episode. On the right side, I just decided to put Representative Liz Cheney as the martyr of a conventional GOP, even though in 2001 and 2000, after Bush won the election, and Dick Cheney was vice president, and we found out how the popular vote went on that election. We found out the politics of how Florida and Jeb Bush being governor kind of helped the Supreme Court, which had a lot of dads, Bush seniors appointments, how all that came to play in order to allow George W. Bush to become president of the United States, and Dick Cheney, who was Secretary of Defense during the first Iraq War, which was when liberating Kuwait from Iraq occupation, and the Second World War was the infamous weapons of mass destruction. So the fact that, and I kind of just talked about this briefly with Dave Nywert, who made us a kind of a graphic sound as a response to the idea that Liz Cheney is now the martyr of the GOP and Mitt Romney, because these are neoconservatives that in many ways are very close to conventional US imperialist military industrial complex type of political philosophy. And they are now considered to be mainstream Republicans who are being in many ways demonized and being censored by their own party because of the influence that the figure at the bottom of that horseshoe on the right side represents, which is Donald Trump, and the far right, or alt-right as it has been termed. He very much represents this as a president who did not want to give up presidential power, was calling for an insurrection, is still under investigation for potential crimes that may have been committed on January 6th, et cetera, et cetera. So there is, I think, very little kind of argument that he has in many ways taken over the conventional GOP, and we'll describe some case studies along those lines in terms of the GOP being divided by Trump's influence and how it's becoming more the party of Trump as opposed to the Republican traditional party of fiscal responsibility and things of that nature. And on the left, or at least left of Biden, I put Senator Sanders, Bernie Sanders, as emblematic of that left of center mindset. He is America's poster politician for socialism, and we talked about that again in part 1 of this episode in terms of how he is not really socialist in the conventional, traditional, historical sense of the word, but for the United States. In this specific historical or political climate, he very much qualifies as a socialist, and he does in many ways have some kind of pro-working class ideas compared to the people on the right side of that horseshoe. But what doesn't necessarily line up, and the reason why I'm talking about this in this 2-part episode, is because it's the notion of a far left that is left ambiguous. We definitely have a far right in the figure of Donald Trump, but I can't seem personally to locate a politician that would fit the far left model. So that's something that I want to explore today, what that would look like. But before we jump into that, let's just briefly make sure that we agree that there's a kind of takeover, if you will, of the traditional Republican Party by people like Donald Trump, and the fact that he now represents a divided GOP. So I have some Washington Post articles, and there's going to be a lot of Washington Post references in this episode. I'm not doing that because I am advocating for a Washington Post subscription. I only do that because I had a subscription for like $30 for an entire year, and they charged me $100 on the renewal that I did not agree to. And when I saw that they charged me $100 for a year for a Washington Post subscription, I was like, hell no. And so I canceled my subscription. And before I was allowed to cancel, a window popped up that said, hey, instead of paying 100, how about $10 for a whole year's digital subscription? And I was like, wow, so you were charging me $100, now you're dropping it to $10, $90 difference. That is price gouging. That's inflation. And that's how it happens. It's to help corporations make more money off the backs of working class people, something that we'll talk about again also later in this episode. But first things first. So first is a Washington Post headline that covers Trump's trip to Texas and how it illustrates his upsides and downsides for Republicans in the midterm elections that are coming up. The actual title of the piece, as you can see in the headline here on the graphic, Trump's Texas trip illustrates his upsides and downsides for Republicans in their midterm hopes. So he was invited to talk about how Biden is and the Democrats are incompetent, and voters need to turn out and vote in the midterm elections in order to take back the House of Representatives and the Senate, since they can't quite take back the presidency yet. That's what Trump's hoping to do in 2024, I believe. And Washington Post also ranked the top 10 Republican candidates for the presidential nomination. And of course, ranked at number one is Donald Trump, which again goes to show, I think, that the GOP is caving to Trump's influence because they understand that the base is responding much more to him than established politicians like Liz Cheney or Mitch McConnell, or pick any GOP, Ted Cruz. Any GOP senator or politician right now seems like Donald Trump still has a very strong, firm grip on the GOP. So he was invited to kind of touch upon these talking points, which he did do. He talked about, Biden's incompetency, the Democrats' incompetency, and how people need to turn out to vote on this coming election. However, he could not help but talk about how he was robbed of an election back in 2020, and how the January 6th insurrectionists might be pardoned if he is elected to be president. And more importantly, he encouraged people to engage in protests across U.S. cities if he is in many ways charged and or convicted of any crimes associated with January 6th. And I would imagine he's probably going to do the same if he's found guilty of any crimes regarding the investigation that's taking place in New York State. So here we go again with an ex-president who cannot help himself in terms of inciting insurrections that are based not necessarily on political points that apply to the nation in general, but that apply to him as an individual. So anytime an individual kind of hijacks national politics for his or her interests, that's when you kind of usually start talking about fascism. So I think at the very least, we can highlight the fact that Trump has inserted himself into the Republican Party, and in many ways is now representative of the politics of the Republican Party. And here we have another headline from the Washington Post that kind of highlights the influence that Trump is having on traditional Republican politics. And this was entitled, "The Heritage Foundation, Former Powerhouse of GOP Policy, Adjusts in the Face of New Competition from Trump Allies." And again, from the Washington Post. And this basically just covers the fact that the Heritage Foundation, which is a think tank that has influenced mainstream Republican policy in Washington for decades, famously known for designing Ronald Reagan's agenda to slash federal spending. This is when a lot of public services were cut during the 80s, and I specifically remember that. I had to take out a government-backed student loan at 8% interest. That's what it was during the Reagan years. Yay, neoliberalism. And now it's leaned more towards the Trumpist side of the GOP divide, focusing on culture wars and centered on education, like attacking critical race theory, for example, or transgender students in schools, all because the GOP needs to compete. In this case, the GOP think tank known as the Heritage Foundation, needs to compete financially with other emerging think tanks that are more aligned with Trump. So we have these Trump loyalists that are emerging in DC, and they're so influential that established mainstream Republican institutions like the Heritage Foundation are adapting to the emerging influence of Trump loyalists, and think tanks around the kind of Trump playbook of how to win back the presidency and how to win back the houses and how to dominate the Supreme Court. And I think Trump at least took care of two of those three check boxes while he was president. He did the most that he could as a president, and he did appoint, I believe, what, 2-3 Supreme Court judges during his 4-year term, which is outrageous. So, and just a couple of more Washington Post articles to highlight the fact that horseshoe model and the people that I inserted there, specifically Donald Trump, as an emblematic or representative of far right politics, is not an exaggeration on my behalf, and it's not necessarily kind of nitpicking or specifically handpicking specific tensions within the party that highlight the influence of Trump. I think these stories highlight the fact that Donald Trump has inserted himself to the point of creating a divide. And this next headline kind of captures that. RNC censure push pits Trump loyalists against DC bubble, widening GOP's internal divide. And this specific news story is about the Republican National Convention's decision to vote to censure two GOP congressional representatives for their role in the January 6th investigation, which exposed the divide within the party after Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, which you know, Mitch has done a lot of things, but when it came to January 6th, he did come out and criticize the Republican National Convention's rebukes of Representatives Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, which I think it exposed the divide even more. You have a former president who is pushing for this censure, and the current leader of the Senate for the GOP, Mitch McConnell, comes out and speaks against this censure, vote to censure. And so I think in many ways, this highlights not only the divide within GOP, but it also highlights the politics of which direction the GOP wants to go. Someone want to return to the traditional cultural wars / fiscal responsibility playbook, whereas Trump is more interested in things like using the phraseology, if you will, of legitimate political discourse to describe the January 6th insurrection. So that's a very concrete divide between one part of the GOP that wants to return to something much more conventional, and kind of new presidential / new GOP embodied in the figure of Donald Trump, who is in favor of attacking the nation's capital and calling the people who actually end up killing Capitol Police officers and making it all the way into the halls of Congress as legitimate political discourse agents, I guess. So yeah, very different attitudes towards what many would consider to be domestic terrorism. And finally, this is another Washington Post article. The headline reads, Garouche to headline GOP lineup of speakers at Federalist Society, media barred from his speech. So there's no actual quotes or video from this visit on behalf of Supreme Court Justice Garouche. But it is safe to say that the Federalist Society is one of the most influential think tanks in Washington, D.C., especially when it comes to conservative causes. So the fact that the Federalist Society, which is a nonprofit organization, is an organization specifically for libertarian lawyers and conservative intellectuals that has served as a pipeline to Trump's judicial choices, including Garouche. So the gathering also included former Vice President Mike Pence and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. So Ron DeSantis right now is being, he's ranked number 2 as presidential candidate, I believe, and the Washington Post kind of weird sports prediction type ranking of potential GOP presidential candidates. But I think DeSantis comes in second to Donald Trump on that front. And I think DeSantis is trying his best in this kind of authoritarian Florida experiment to try to out Trump at his own politics. So the conservative ideological narrative of equivalence between the far right and, in this case, the far left, is centered on an imaginary enemy most of the time, like Antifa, a term that in many instances describes ordinary people who were outraged at and thus protested against systemic violence and injustice, specifically after the murder of George Floyd. But many people that engaged in protests against police violence and state violence were met with state violence, which brought out even more people into the streets. And I think, again, Portland was indicative of this, especially when you saw the mobs come out and, try to find out what the hell is going on here. And they ended up getting maced themselves, which just shows that when it comes to police violence, if push comes to shove, police are very open to non-discriminatory abuse. So the fact that, and it makes me wonder what Antifa means to some of these people, because the entire United States was anti-fascist during World War II. And it makes me think of the civil rights movement, and if the term Antifa existed back then, if it would have been attributed to individuals like Martin Luther King, for example, just for the purposes of politicizing the civil rights in a manner that would come across as more domestic terroristic, as opposed to what it was, which was a push for civil liberties for traditionally marginalized, racialized communities. So why is a horseshoe nonsense? Theory nonsense. I included a link to a blog titled Bob from Broccoli, who has I thought, a really reader-friendly analysis of why the horseshoe theory is nonsense. That's the title of the blog. And the whole idea is that there's no equivalent. So I try to look up a few examples of people making that argument. And I ironically ran into an old Stanford professor, Russell Berman, that I did not take a class with, unfortunately, but I was very much wanting to take a class. He was described to me by some of my other professors as someone who is an intellectual in the tradition of the Frankfurt School, critical theory, and things that I was personally interested at that time while I was at graduate school. So I took a look at his essay or article in the magazine, I believe, online magazine Tablet. There's a website and there's a link in the show notes or episode notes, and you can find those at theidentityparadox.com. And I highly encourage you to check out the links and fact check what I'm saying. But I read the essay, and Berman tries to make an argument about left totalitarianism, and he uses specific historical examples, quotes people like Hannah Arendt and Rosa Luxemburg on this issue. But he actually starts off the article and frames it around Trump's Mount Rushmore speech, which I found interesting. And what I found even more kind of alarming, especially if, this is someone that you wanted to study with back when you were in graduate school, and now you're reading an essay that is foregrounding Donald Trump's Mount Rushmore speech as somehow indicative of what left fascism is. That's the title of the piece, Left Fascism. I started to read, and then I decided not to necessarily quote from the article. It's kind of a roller coaster theoretical ride in terms of ups and downs, in terms of making that argument about left fascism, if you're going to start with right fascism as your kind of standard for neutrality. And I say that because in this essay on left fascism, Berman talks about how the right to free speech that Trump defends and protecting history from angry mobs, which is in many ways a kind of attack on critical race theory and revisionist history that talks about some of the awful things that the United States has done as a nation in order to become the kind of global power that it is now. Trump's discussion about angry mobs and protecting history, specifically certain statues that honor Confederate heroes being toppled, was in many ways indicative of left fascism. In other words, people on the left are intolerant of people like Robert Lee, and Trump is calling attention to this. And so we cannot erase our history, and toppling statues is equivalent to erasing history, I guess, for Professor Berman. And so, yeah, I'm not going to go further into that, but that's his example of left fascism, which I found highly problematic. So I just left a link in the show notes if you want to check out that essay. But yeah, I became less and less interested in it as I was reading it, especially in terms of the framing. So just let's come back to the US context and leave Mount Rushmore and Donald Trump behind for a second. So the reality is that we have a centrist kind of politics that accommodates two parties who prioritize re-elections at the end of the day, which is why we have the same campaign promises made every election cycle, and they remain unrealized, only to resurface during the next election cycle during similar campaigns. And it's just kind of a vicious cycle that this country is stuck in when it comes to social change. There are always promises made during campaign years and election years, but a lot of those promises remain to this day unfulfilled. And you can go back decades in terms of what, and I'll highlight one of those later on in this episode. So what this essentially does, when both parties are essentially at the end of the day running on similar, recycled political talking points and looking to win the House and win the Senate and win the presidency, what a lot of them are looking for is re-election or regaining power to some degree. And in many ways, this creates what some people call a duopoly. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with the term, a duopoly is essentially when two parties or suppliers dominate a specific market or situation. Think of a market, for example. So two suppliers dominate the market for a commodity or for a service. Like in this country, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party dominate politics. It's very difficult for a third party to get into that conversation simply because that duopoly has done a great job historically of making sure that any third party that emerges is marginalized financially, and that the donors who are giving to both the Republicans and to Democrats do not necessarily end up funding a third party to the point where a third party becomes an actual contender for House seats, Senate seats, or dare we say, the presidency. So in many ways, you can argue that a duopoly applies to the United States when it comes to political representation. You're going to go red, you're going to go blue, you're going to go Democrat, or you're going to go Republican. This duopoly allows for career politicians, which is a big problem because that basically means that you can be a politician that is for profit as while you're serving as a public servant, and that happens a lot. We call that a conflict of interest, and we talked about that during part one of this episode, and Nancy Pelosi's reluctance to prohibit members of Congress from engaging in individual stock trading, and lower members of the House trying to pass a law that will prohibit members of Congress in doing so and engaging in the individual stock trading. So people that make a lot of money off of that, like Nancy Pelosi, who is, I believe, the wealthiest or among the wealthiest people in Congress, is not necessarily happy with that, especially considering that her husband is, I believe, a stock trader or engages in individual stock trading. So when you have career politicians that basically, make profit off of their public service, at the end of the day, what happens is that you get both parties that tailor their politics in many ways to the financial class, to donors, and to people that will get them reelected in terms of funding. They go out there and they promise things to voters who will go out and check the boxes, but the people that are going to pay for the ads, the travel, the staffing, and all that other stuff are the people that we call lobbyists, or donors, high rollers, if you will, that get to attend private dinners and actually have the ear of these politicians, direct lines, direct access. And a lot of the times they go through lobbyists, but sometimes they're so powerful that you actually have a direct line to the president, like Mike Lindell and Donald Trump, for example. And Mike Lindell's my pillow guy, in case you forgot who he was already. And I don't blame you if you do, or if you did. So both parties agree on the importance of money, which is why fundraising is the backbone of US politics. And you always hear about fundraising. You'll have politicians encourage you to donate to their specific party, more so than you will hear politicians encourage you to engage in local mutual aid in your community. So I think that's a very interesting way of engaging in politics, right? Party-oriented politics that function around money. This is why Democratic leaders like Pelosi, and already said this, are hesitant to pass certain types of laws, like the ones prohibiting individual stock trading. And this is why Pacific party leaders like Nancy Pelosi on one side and Mitch McConnell on the other side run parties and control the massive distribution of funds needed to run campaigns. And this is why it's very difficult for ordinary citizens who don't have these connections with established politicians to run for local representation. You might get that done at the local state level, but it's very difficult to become a US representative without having backing from the party that you are affiliating with. And if you're a third party candidate, good luck. It's very difficult, very challenging to get into politics as an independent or as a third-party candidate, which is why most people, even if they have a politics that they consider to be more extreme than the right-wing party or more extreme than the current left-wing party, nonetheless affiliate themselves as or identify themselves as Democrats or Republicans, because at the end of the day, that's where the funding comes from. So, and there's also a lot of potential for self-enrichment, and that's taking place right now around one specific senator from West Virginia, and that is Joe Manchin, who, for example, decided to vote against his own party's promised agenda of helping out the working class. He's one of these people that think that inflation is a result of too many people getting too much money from the government in the form of stimulus checks, and that's why inflation has happened. It's not because corporations that are making record profits have decided to go after the working class and during a pandemic and price gouge them. And that's not what's happening. That's not the problem, even though that has been proven with very concrete evidence in terms of profits from last year and what happened and how that corresponds to inflation. Record profits from Amazon, record profits from a lot of tech companies, including Apple, Microsoft, etc., Facebook, and not the Facebook charges, but prices are still going up, right? McDonald's, record-breaking prices of food are still going up. So Joe Manchin blames the working class for inflation and the government giving the working class some kind of financial assistance during a very difficult time, i.e. a pandemic. And so he decided to vote against extending the child tax credit specifically. And so as a consequence of him not voting in favor of this, and Senator from Arizona is no less guilty, millions of children are now finding themselves in poverty again. And so thanks to him voting no, there are 3.7 million more children in poverty in January of 2022 because of the fact that there is no monthly child tax credit. And there's a headline there again, and a link to a news story that covers that. What I consider important about that, this is kind of old news. Everybody knows that Manchin was going to vote no. He did vote no. People know that he is, in addition to the entire GOP voting no against it, the Democrats needed Joe Manchin's vote, and he decided to come out and vote no against it. This is connected to a lot of power that he has gained as being the swing vote between passing legislation and not. And one way that he personally benefits from this is by proxy. So for example, even if Joe Manchin is not pocketing money directly as a consequence of him voting no, political allies like Larry Puccio, a longtime friend of Manchin's, and title of the next headline here, Larry and I will always be together. Joe Manchin's closest political ally cashes in on the senator's rise, highlights the fact that even though we tend to associate the Republican Party with kind of cash, grifting its base, specifically the working class, Democrats are no different. And here's a case study, Joe Manchin voting no on the child tax credit and yet cashing in terms of his closest political ally, and admitting to the fact that he and Larry Puccio will always be friends. And here I'm just going to quote directly from the article, in this article from the Washington Post. Barely a month after Democrats reclaimed the Senate last year, turning the ability to sway Manchin into a sought-after skill, Larry Puccio registered for the first time as a federal lobbyist. So isn't that interesting now that Joe Manchin has emerged as a swing vote, as someone that you want to kind of sway to your side, either one way or the other. Larry Puccio decided to register as a federal lobbyist because he is the middleman between you and Joe Manchin, regardless of who you are. So in less than a year, Puccio has cashed in. He and a partner have lobbied the Senate almost exclusively, according to disclosure filings, pulling in more than $310,000 in addition to his earnings from his extensive state-level lobbying business in West Virginia, which is Joe Manchin's home state. So Larry Puccio is not only making money off of being the middleman between the people and businesses in the community and Joe Manchin in West Virginia, he's now doing that in Washington, D.C. The article continues, the Appalachian Natural Gas Operators Coalition, which is in West Virginia, paid Puccio and his partner, Angel Moore, $180,000 last year to lobby the Senate and the Energy Department on, quote, proposed taxes and fees related to energy production, according to disclosure filings. So here you have a case study, again, of a corporation, in this case, the Appalachian Natural Gas Operators Coalition, paying $180,000 to get Puccio to lobby the Energy Department, in addition to Congress, regarding taxes and fees that are connected to the energy sector and the energy production. So this is why corporations that are making record-breaking profits don't pay taxes, because they pay that much money to lobby individuals that are connected to these senators and to these Congress representatives, and essentially pay enough money in order to convince them to convince established politicians in DC to not tax the rich and to not tax corporations, which means that the burden of taxes keeps falling on middle and working class individuals. Again, just an example of how Democrats are not immune to the influence of money, and you can go from Nancy Pelosi all the way to Manchin and Sinema and a lot of other individuals. So, and this is taking place during inflation, right? And I highlighted the fact that Manchin's idea is that we gave too many working class people too much money, and now we've thrown too much, basically too many dollar bills into the economy, and that's why prices are going up. It's not that a supply chain problem. It's not that corporations are necessarily trying to make record-breaking profits off the backs of working class people by raising prices when they don't necessarily need to. They're trying to maintain and chase record-breaking profits. They broke a record last year, why not break it the next year, right? So this next article, entitled Survival Mode, Inflation Falls Hardest on Low-Income Americans, highlights the fact that the kind of thinking that Joe Manchin represents is not factual. I'm just going to quote here directly from the article in order to get quickly through this point. While inflation is rising everywhere, price hikes are particularly devastating to lower income households with already tight budgets. Nearly all their expenses go to necessities, food, energy, utilities, and housing like rent or mortgage, which have seen some of the largest increases at different points over the past year. So utilities have spiked, especially if you live in places like Texas, right? And there's a winter storm coming. we've all seen and probably felt the increase in food prices and rent. My rent's going up, everybody's rent's going up, house prices are going through the roof, and a lot of us are wondering where these people getting this money from. Of the 10 categories with the highest levels of pandemic inflation analyzed by the Washington Post, lower earners, working class people, spent a greater share of their total spending on most of them, which are basic necessities, from natural gas, again, utilities, to beef, food. The highest earners, the upper middle class, or just the wealthy class at this point. I don't even know if we have an upper middle class without being necessarily a millionaire or rich anymore. The highest earners outspent the lowest on cars and furniture. So there's a difference. The rich people in this nation during an inflation period are concerning themselves with buying things like cars and furniture, while working class people are having to make decisions between buying food, paying rent, or paying utilities. So the poor struggle for basic necessities as inflation rises, but the highest earners in society worry about how inflation impacts cars and furniture. That's democracy in the United States. So another kind of example of how democracy and capitalism are incompatible when it comes to at least things like economic, if not economic and social justice. So how can this happen? Well, the last episode, we spoke about the ways in which culture wars distract from the continuation of class warfare by the wealthy class and by politicians they put in power. The impoverishment of children due to the intentionally expired child tax credit is just one obvious example. So let's briefly go back to culture wars centered on identity politics specifically, and particularly the example that I brought up last time, which is the LGBTQ plus culture wars that are taking place across the country. Examples of this are happening within the GOP specifically in regards to the upcoming election, and they're focusing a lot on education, as I already said, whether it's vaccine or mask mandates, or whether it's the teaching of critical race theory, or whether it's transgender education. And it's the latter one that I want to focus on briefly for right now. Ron DeSantis' Florida is a laboratory for this stuff, right? That's where the Don't Say Gay bill is being passed right now. And they're targeting critical race theory also. They're basically criminalizing educators for addressing questions and concerns that some students may actually raise in the classroom. And the specific point of DeSantis's Don't Say Gay bill is to prohibit educators from discussing sexual identities in public schools, especially elementary schools, kindergartners through third graders. And a lot of people were saying, well, that's a very common sense position to take. It's not when you actually study the psychology of developmental psychology around children, specifically children that are transgender and don't have any role modeling socially in order to feel like they fit into society. When society is divided along a gender binary, transgender children tend to have a very difficult time feeling accepted or feeling like they belong. So talking about this with young children who ask, it's not like you're trying to indoctrinate children who are not asking, you're not pulling kids off the street and making them watch films or read a book. You're addressing situations and issues as they emerge in the classroom in an educational setting when students ask these types of questions. And as an educator, you should be allowed to at least address that issue, if not for the entire class, at least be able to speak with that individual student one-to-one about the questions that they have. And in Florida, they're making this basically illegal or something that educators could be severely disciplined and punished for. The problem is that studies show that speaking about realities like gender fluid identities and how bodies sometimes don't reflect our gendered identities is crucial to the mental health of transgender kids. And that's what worries educators like myself. Moreover, it helps young people begin to navigate their gendered identity in a manner that empowers them and affirms and allows them to affirm it later in their lives, whether it's in adolescence or whether it's as young adults or maybe even later as adults. Having those conversations and having that knowledge develop early on in your childhood can be incredibly important to how you develop as a human being. More importantly, studies show that transgender teens who have access to such resources live healthier, happier lives than individuals who do not have access to such resources and conversations, or even things like conversion therapies, right? So usually when this is the case, suicide rates go up. And I've included a couple of articles that deal with this issue. There's one from PLOS, which is a nonprofit open access publisher of peer-reviewed articles in science and medicine. And the title of that article, and then again, it's in the show notes on theidentityparadox.com, access to gender-affirming hormones during adolescence and mental health outcomes among transgender adults. And basically the study just says that individuals and adolescents that have access to gender-affirming hormones and to these kinds of conversations end up having healthier lives and end up being happier as individuals. And so in order to kind of translate the scientific studies that peer-reviewed article highlights, I included an article to Today. I guess the morning show Today has a website, and I found a very reader-friendly article that talks specifically about this study and has a link to the PLOS study. So you don't want to read a kind of scientific article around these issues, feel free to check out the Today site entitled Trans Teens Who Get Gender-Affirming Hormones Are Healthier, Happier as Adults. So feel free to check out that article, which is basically saying the same thing. So now that this LGBT plus and anti-critical race theory movement keeps growing across the US, it's impacting many states and many educators. There are some other issues that many politicians are talking about on either side. So let me rephrase that. Not many politicians are talking about on either side, right? So a lot of people are centering on this, specifically on the GOP side of the culture wars, in terms of trying to make transgender issues, trying to make critical race theory, trying to make education the center of their kind of campaign during this election cycle. Democrats in some of these states are engaging in these culture wars, and what happens is that you end up talking a lot about these issues, which are very important specifically and obviously to those communities, but what ends up not happening is you don't end up talking about other issues, and I want to talk about what those other issues are. This is where you can begin to see a supposed convergence of left-right politics. However, in debunking the horseshoe model of US politics, I want to first highlight some of the problems and unfulfilled promises that the supposed democratic left has left us with, right? So, and I want to come back to this issue of culture wars, because for many of us, issues that many people ascribe as cultural, or that many people identify as belonging to this sphere of politics that we call the culture wars, in many ways may be tied to issues of resources, access to resources, distribution of wealth, and just the allocation of specific public funds and how they're spent. And at the end of the day, if that kind of distribution of public wealth, let's call it, was more just, many of these issues that we identify as culture wars would not be taking place, simply stated. So we can come back to that. But first, let's talk about how the left has failed in terms of its own promises, and in many ways kind of is a non-existent entity in this nation, politically speaking. We talk about the Democratic Party as the party of the left, but in reality, a lot of us don't see the Democratic Party as representative of leftist concerns and or leftist political aspirations, like defunding police departments and reallocating those millions of dollars that are given to law enforcement every year. And I'm not just saying their budget, I'm saying on top of last year's budget, they constantly keep increasing these budgets rather than doing that, reallocating some of those millions of dollars into public services and public programs that would help people in poor communities, that might take them out of cycles of criminality and specifically poverty, because there's obviously a strong connection between crime and poverty. So the first link here is to one of my biggest, if not one of my biggest complaints against the Democratic Party is the lack of immigration reform, right? This next article from NPR is entitled, President Biden Promised to Reform Immigration Policy. How has that been going? And this is actually an interview on NPR with an NPR correspondent who follows migration and reports on migration, and there's a specific quote from that specific NPR representative. President Biden came into office promising a change of direction after former President Trump's immigration crackdown. He had an ambitious agenda to overhaul the nation's border policies, but as the end of the year approaches, many of those proposals have been blocked, reversed, or simply abandoned. Abandoned efforts to financially compensate separated families, kids in cages, and currently seeking to contract private firms to create new immigration asylums, basically camps along the borders. And I apologize. First part of that was a quote from the article. Second half was me describing what the article was talking about. So the article ends with the or simply abandoned, end of quote. And I'm talking abandoned in terms of efforts to compensate families, and the interview goes into all this stuff. So I'm not necessarily putting things on there. I'm just paraphrasing at this point, right? There was going to be financial compensation to families who were separated at the border. That's out. They were going to, and now what Biden is trying to do is contract private firms in order to create new immigration asylum centers, or whatever you want to call them, basically camps along the border. So that's in many ways the failure of Democrats to engage in any kind of leftist politics regarding things like immigration. Next point. Here's a headline. Lawyers say that Biden administration is still rejecting some refugees once banned by Trump. And here again, we're dealing with immigration. And I'm going to read from the actual Washington Post article here. The mother and younger brother of the Mohammed family, it's a Somalian family that the news article is focusing on, were one flight away when President Donald Trump issued an order blocking refugees from Somalia and other predominantly Muslim nations he considered security risks. President Biden called the bans un-American, and the Mohammeds rejoiced when he rescinded the ban, or rescinded them last year. So here we have a family who was elated, very, very happy that Trump lost and Biden won, and that Biden rescinded Trump's basically Muslim ban in terms of immigration. But months later, the article continues, U.S. officials rejected the Mohammeds again and would not say why. Documents provided by their lawyers show. Federal officials declined to comment, citing privacy rules, and said they are committed to welcoming more refugees after subjecting them to rigorous vetting. So, new president, right? President Biden, same old story on immigration. So let's try another topic like climate change. Unfortunately, this is also, if not the same, worse under a Democratic president. This is from the Washington Post. And again, I'm just going to read from the actual article. If your sirens in the background, that's downtown Minneapolis. 1 year after announcing a halt to any federal oil and gas leasing, Biden has outpaced Donald Trump in issuing drilling permits on public lands. After setting a record for the largest offshore lease sale last year in the Gulf of Mexico, the Interior Department plans to auction off oil and gas drilling rights on more than 200,000 acres across Western states by the end of March, followed by 1 million acres in the Cook Inlet off the coast of Alaska. The administration's actions reveal an uncomfortable truth. Although Biden supports a shift to cleaner sources of energy, he has failed to curb fossil fuel development in the United States. So here's another example of President Biden promising something during the campaigning leading up to the elections. Once he wins the election, there are the sirens. Never mind on immigration. Never mind on, well, I'm going to get into the other ones, but first and foremost, never mind on the immigration reform, and never mind on environmental policies that I promised. So not only did Biden fail to take immediate actions on stopping development of things like Line 3 here in Minnesota, which goes through the Great Lakes, but it seems like he's intent on expanding the environmental crisis that the fossil fuel industry perpetuates at an extreme level. So immigration, big fail, big kind of not only a fail, but I would say a betrayal of a certain kind of campaign promise. And in terms of climate change and environmental policies, an even bigger failure, if that's possible, along those lines, because he's actually increasing that. So let's look at something like Medicare, because President Biden is fairly elderly, and so he must be worried about Medicare, right? People his age. And this is a link to an article, again in the show notes, entitled "Joe Biden is quietly pursuing the creeping privatization of Medicare." And this is found in Jacobin online. And there's a link to that again in the show notes. Quote, "Locked doors, unreturned emails, a large crowd with no one around to hear it. Nothing more perfectly captured the struggle of public healthcare advocates to raise the alarm about direct contracting, a pilot program begun under Donald Trump and continued under Joe Biden." So notice the things that Joe Biden is continuing to do that Trump started, as if there's a great shift from one president to the other. And now that we're on the verge of potentially engaging in a war, at least not a Cold War, but a temperate war with Russia, I think that it's very important to keep in mind the continuation of certain types of thinking. And I know Trump was in many ways a kind of Putin puppet to many people, but nevertheless, these tensions with Russia remain in one form or the other, right? It's not like we're moving on from those types. And I know that Putin is to blame for a lot of what's taking place right now, but the kind of saber rattling and the media obsession with a impending potential war almost seems to be a escalation of tensions, and it's almost like a calling for. This is not 1991 where you can use CNN to kind of place Saddam Hussein in terms of where the U.S. troop military retaliation is going to come from. And if you remember, for those of you that are old enough, what they did with television was very, very intelligent. It was basically a psychological operation against Saddam Hussein, who the United States government knew was watching CNN. So they basically used CNN against him and got him to fall for a fake, while the United States was audibly, to use a football metaphor. Apologies to those of you who don't know that terminology. So continued under Donald Trump and continued under Joe Biden. What direct contracting does is turn the public side of Medicare into a corporate goldmine, says Diane Archer, president of Just Care USA. So it seems like Biden is a big advocate for privatization. We're seeing him try to do that with the asylum seekers and potential immigration centers along the border for asylum seekers. He did that. That was happening in the 90s, back when he was a senator under the Clinton administration. There's a lot of privatization was taking place there. And in this country, one of the biggest industries that has been privatized is a prison industrial complex. And I've seen a lot of that in Arizona. We import prisoners from other states, especially California, which has an overpopulation problem when it comes to its prisons. Arizona decided to criminalize undocumented immigration in order to fill up those for-profit prisons that are privatized. And this is where you get that specific season in Orange is the New Black, where they start talking about like the quality of food, the quality of healthcare. Everything becomes worse when a prison is taken over by a private for-profit corporation, because they're going to try and cut corners everywhere they can in order to make more profit, make more money. So every cell, they get a certain amount of money per day, just like charter schools do from the federal government, from the state government, and they're going to try to maximize that daily amount of money for purposes of profit and minimize it for purposes of doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is providing a public service. Yes, even jails and prisons are a form of public service. Sorry. So that is happening under the Biden administration in regards to Medicaid, and that's just going to raise prices if that takes place. They're not going to go down if it is privatized. So even in terms of Medicare and Medicaid, Biden is looking towards the private sector as a solution, as opposed to trying to create a more just tax system in which wealthy individuals pay their fair share of taxes and pay or help pay for things like Medicare, so it does not have to be privatized in that manner. So since Medicare and Medicaid and the environment and immigration reform is not happening in terms of improvement, let's look at policing and the justice system. Yeah, like that's going to turn out well, right? Anyway, so we all know that police violence, especially here in Minneapolis, is not dissipating. It's not going away. It's not lessening. The shooting and the murder of Amir Bach while he was asleep in his family's home, I think, is indicative of that. So I think it's very important to keep in mind that the same things that were happening in 2020 continue to happen in 2022, and whoever is president doesn't seem to matter because the message is clear at the state level, at the city level, and at the federal level. So we went from abolish the police, right? Remember, a lot of politicians, a lot of city council members were really seriously considering abolishing the police. We went from that to defund, right? We don't need to overfund police departments. We could defund them. They get a lot of money from taxpayers, a lot of budgets, city budgets, local budgets, state budgets go towards law enforcement. And we went from defunding to reform, right? Maybe we could just have different forms of training and more community engagement, et cetera, to just throwing more money at them at the end of the day. So we went from abolish to more funding. And that's because defunding the police is in the position of the Democratic Party. Despite taking all those knees in Washington, D.C. and across the nation and watching all those police officers take a knee after George Floyd's murder. And this is not accounting for the fact that Democrats have increased military funding while cutting benefits to the working class, like the child tax credit. So here's a headline on Nancy Pelosi talking about defunding the police. Not going to happen. And here is a video of Nancy Pelosi talking about or stating the fact that defund the police is not the position of the Democratic Party.
How do you think Democrats should address rising crime?
Well, with all the respect in the world for Cord Bush, that is not the position of the Democratic Party.
So there's been an increase in killings in 2021, according to a Washington Post report. And here's a link to in the headline. Fatal police shootings in 2021 set records since the Post began tracking despite public outcry. So again, people have been protesting, have been demonstrating against the increase in police violence. And yet 2021 was the highest, 2021 recorded the most police killings of any year since the Post started to record these type of statistics. So last year, there was an increase, a record-setting increase in police killings, not a decrease as a consequence of what happened in 2020. And it just goes to show that Democrats are not necessarily calling attention to this problem as a problem that needs immediate attention because they're distracted by so many other things, including culture wars. And these are things that people have been adamantly asking for, specifically in places like Portland, like Minneapolis, like New York City, where we have seen firsthand eyewitness accounts, video footage of police brutality and police violence against innocent people, especially in regards to things like no-knock warrants, right? So reform doesn't work. I mean, we see this with Amir Locke. There was a body cam. They opened the door. This young man wakes up. He has no idea who's charging into his apartment. And as you know, he's a legal gun owner who has a permit to carry, and rather than de-escalating the situation, they do what they always do, and they shoot first, and they murdered an innocent young Black man who was not even the target of the warrant. He had nothing to do with it, and now he's dead. Again, and this happens all the time. So here's an article, a link from Washington Post. Minneapolis suspends use of no-knock warrants as scrutiny, of contentious police tactic mounts. And this was a police tactic, the no-knock warrant, that Mayor Fry basically campaigned on. He said that he was going to get rid of it if he was reelected. He was reelected. He was endorsed by newspapers like the Star Tribune. And what happens when there's a no-knock warrant murder by police? Mayor of Minneapolis hides behind, people didn't do what I wanted them to do and my hands were tied and I just couldn't. There's been a lot of that. And you can look at the various interviews with him around that issue. He just defers accountability. And he'll say that it ends with him. But at the end of the day, when cornered, he's very quick to explain why he couldn't do anything about it, even though he really, really wanted to. The next article, or actually this is a Star Tribune tweet, because I don't have a Star Tribune subscription and I refuse to pay for that, even if it is $10 a year, which is not. Minnesota Senate passes $1 million marketing proposal to promote police. And this is a tweet that talks about the fact that Minnesota Senate has kind of fast-tracked a $65 million worth of taxpayer money for the recruitment and retention of law enforcement in Minnesota, with $1 million budgeted specifically for advertisements that would recommend policing as a second profession. So yeah, here in Minnesota, we're asking people that already have one job if they might want to pick up a second job that includes carrying a gun. So if you're not tired from your first job, feel free to apply to become a law enforcement officer in the state of Minnesota, where you can go home, have a quick dinner, and go be a police officer at night carrying a gun, or a law enforcement officer, possibly sheriff, state trooper. You never know. There's various agencies you can apply to. Literally, you can see the tweet in the link. You can probably see the tweet on the screen right now. $65 million increase in funding and $1 million specifically allocated for advertising law enforcement as a second profession. That's ridiculously stupid. I mean, you don't want people picking up law enforcement as a second job. You already have enough police officers that moonlight as security guards or whatever. You don't want to encourage that as the model. You want to discourage that as a model. You want to prohibit law enforcement officers from having second jobs, because their first job is includes carrying a firearm, and it could potentially lead to unintentional murders. Is there such a thing? I wonder. Here's a tweet from Governor Walz, who's very concerned about gun violence when it happens in high schools, when it happens on the side of law enforcement murdering innocent civilians. Governor Walz is suspiciously quiet on that front. Here's another link to another article and a headline: officers charged in George Floyd's killing omitted key details from the scene. Minneapolis officer testifies. This is again Washington Post. And the reason why I included this headline on this specific segment of the episode is to talk about the fact that people want to reform policing in this country. And this is evident of the fact that you can't, because cops lie to each other when they have to, because when they know they're in trouble, they're just going to lie to their superiors, or they're going to try to. And in this specific case, this lieutenant, I believe, was asked to testify. And when he was testifying, and this is during the current trial of the other 3 officers involved in the George Floyd's murder, they lied to the commanding officer on site when he arrived, and in court, he stated that what they told him at that moment differed drastically from the facts that later emerged. So they lied, basically. And this next headline, again, from the Washington Post: former Minneapolis officer says he detected no, quote, serious medical need as he restrained George Floyd, indicates the fact that they lie. And in this case, they think they can hide behind some kind of incompetence, as if ineptitude or incompetence is some kind of immunity. In this case, they're claiming that they didn't think George Floyd needed any medical assistance, even after they checked for a pulse twice and didn't find any. So in my mind, if you check someone for a pulse and they don't demonstrate a pulse, that is a serious symptom of medical need, of someone that needs immediate medical assistance. You don't ignore the fact that someone doesn't have a pulse twice. And in their minds, it's like, well, you know, I was just a rookie, or I wasn't the senior officer. And yes, I was trained that we shouldn't do it that way, but I was confused as to what technique Chauvin was using at the moment. So I just stayed quiet and kept checking the pulse, I guess. So why is Pelosi and the Democratic Party so hesitant to defund police departments in light of all this stuff? Lying, another murder, no-knock warrants being allowed, the police violence that's happening in places like Portland and New York City, Los Angeles, with houseless people, etc. Why aren't our leading political representatives, specifically Democrats, fighting this? Well, I'm not even going to talk about abolishing in this case. I'm just going to talk about defunding. Why are people like Nancy Pelosi hesitant, and even President Biden hesitant to even talk about or entertain the idea of defunding the police? Is because, and I'm saying not defunding for the just sake of punishing police departments. I'm saying defunding in order to take those taxpayer dollars and redistribute them within the community, into community programs, into policing alternatives that don't necessarily require people walking around with firearms. You have more mental health experts out in the streets. A lot of these calls that people have in 911 are usually people undergoing a mental health crisis. There was just this North Miami police officer who murdered, basically a mental health, I guess, counselor who was trying to help a young man, an autistic young man who was undergoing a mental health crisis, and he was on the ground with his hands up, trying to calm down the individual with autism who was playing with the toy truck. And this police officer shot the wrong person. He meant to shoot the autistic person holding the toy truck, and accidentally shot the mental health counselor that was on site right next to this poor autistic individual undergoing a mental health crisis. Now he's dead. And this police officer was found not guilty on any charges, and I think is back on the job. This stuff keeps happening. So why are they so hesitant to defund that money and distribute it in different social programs to combat things like poverty? Remember the war on poverty? Remember that? You don't? You should check out LBJ's it was called the War on Poverty, and I think it was the State of the Union address in 1964. He brought it up. So this country actually declared war on poverty back in 1964, and LBJ famously gave that State of the Union speech where he declared that war on poverty, and Martin Luther King was organizing a march against poverty again to DC, and right before that, he was murdered. And isn't that interesting? So this is why you keep throwing money at a police state, because police protect property. Property is equivalent to money in this country, and money gets you reelected. So at the end of the day, challenging the police is a way of challenging property and the people that protect property. So at the end of the day, challenging the police means challenging capital. And to challenge capital as a politician is basically kind of signing your own symbolic death sentence, because you're not going to get the type of funding that this nation requires for you to get any realistic chance at being entertained as a candidate by a large amount of the population that you're going to be representing, because you are not going to get ad money, you're not going to get staff money, you're going to have to basically be knocking door to door. And a lot of people try to do that, and I think it comes from good intentions, but at the end of the day, you're going to need funding, and that's where the parties come in. So this is how capitalist fascism functions. Money is the point of convergence between the left and right. So if there is going to be convergence, and I don't think it happens politically, I think it happens in terms of money when it comes to the United States. The established duopoly that I mentioned earlier in this country leaves us with no real leftist political movement or representation, at least nothing comparable to what has happened on the right side of the divide, and that's how much the Overton window has shifted, right? Where Liz Cheney is now a conventional Republican, and Donald Trump is a far-right Republican, and Biden is traditionally centrist, and the only kind of leftism we have in this country are leftist politicians or people like Bernie Sanders, and you can count them literally in both hands. That's the amount of politicians in general they have across the United States that represent that kind of mentality. So, is there such a thing as a fascist creep on the left? Yes, that can happen. It's usually capitalism, which is the strongest currency of power in our specific political economy here in the United States, meaning that the richer you are, the more political and economic power you acquire. That's all I mean by saying that money, capital, is a currency of power in the United States. This type of convergence actually has a name. It's called corporatism. So here's a link to an article or essay. This is published in the Foundation for Economic Education. It's written by Robert Higgs, who's an American economic historian and economist who describes himself as a libertarian anarchist. I think that's kind of interesting, in political and legal theory and public policy. So Robert Higgs, the title is Quasi-Corporatism, America's Homegrown Fascism. And I'm going to quote directly from the, I guess I'll call this an essay. Full-fledged corporatism requires the replacement of political representation according to area of residence by political representation according to position in the socioeconomic division of labor. So what he's saying here is that in corporatism, you're not, as a resident, you're not going to be representative. You're not going to be representative of, you're not going to be represented according to your region. So for example, I'm not going to vote in local Minnesota or Minneapolis elections and Minnesota state elections and US federal elections based on where I live geographically under corporatist states. And I'm going to continue to quote here, the citizen of a corporate state has a political identity, not as a resident of a particular geographical district, which was what I was trying to describe as a Minneapolis resident, but as a member of a certain occupation, profession, or other economic community. So in this case, I may vote as an educator, not as a resident of Minneapolis or Minnesota. I may vote as a member of a specific economic class and not as a resident of Minneapolis and Minnesota, and obviously the United States. Quoting, he will probably be distinguished according to whether he is an employer, an employee, or self-employed. One who looks for information about corporatism is frequently referred to fascism. In the International Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, for example, the entry for corporatism reads simply, see fascism. Political scientists have concluded correctly that the United States is not a corporate state. So he's making that point. He's not saying that we live in a corporate state in the United States. He's saying that political scientists have correctly identified the United States as not being a corporate state. And here comes the big moment, right? Nevertheless, or however, or but, nevertheless, recent American history has brought forth a multitude of little corporatisms. Arrangements within subsectors, industries, here we go to the prison industrial complex, or other partial jurisdictions. They have drawn on both national and state government powers. Here I draw, again, a connection between the prison industrial complex and the politics of Arizona and the politics of criminalizing undocumented immigrants in the state of Arizona. They have drawn on both national and state government powers. They operate effectively in the defense sector in many areas of agriculture, right? And this is where agribusiness has a big say in terms of local and state politics, not to mention larger national politics. In many professional services such as medicine, dentistry, and hospital care, is where corporatism functions, little corporatisms, and in a variety of other areas such as the fishery management and urban redevelopment. And this is where you have permits to drill in certain places. Sort of, for example, Line 3 up here in Minnesota, even as going through indigenous land, the federal government overrides and allows for permits, makes exemptions, et cetera, et cetera. These are the little corporatisms that Higgs is talking about. Or, for example, dismantling George Floyd Square, which was a very grassroots, from the ground up, people in the community wanted it, built it, had it there, and the city government, essentially because of urban redevelopment, came and did away with it. These abundant iron triangles normally involve well-organized private interest groups, lobbying, Joe Manchin's good old friend, government regulatory spending or lending agencies, banks and their connections to, regulatory bodies like certain agencies within the federal government or state government, read that, and the congressional subcommittees charged with policy oversight or appropriations. And this is one thing that people keep calling out the Democratic Party on. Joe Manchin still sits on certain committees that they could kick him off of, but they won't. And they're asking if he voted against you, why is he still on these serving on these major committees, right? And these are the contradictions that people have a hard time reconciling in terms of leftism in the United States. A political economy in which such arrangements predominate, like here in the US, as they do in the United States, sorry, that's in the article, is commonly called interest group liberalism or neo-pluralism, but it might just as well be called disaggregated neo-corporatism or quasi-corporatism, which is America's homegrown fascism, according to Higgs. So neo-corporatism is a type of fascism that allows for the US duopoly to always abide the master's call, and the master is money. The difference between leftist politicians and on-the-ground leftists, and this is a very important difference, I believe, what we sometimes refer to as activists, though this title, activist, can also be used to grift people. So it's important to pay attention to who's an activist is on the ground and actually doing things versus someone who calls themselves an activist and is just kind of like a social media influencer and asking you for money at the same time. Is that the latter, people on the ground, non-political or non-politician leftists, call for maximizing freedoms in a global context, while the right reverts to the ethos of individualism and nationalism, and established Democrats lie somewhere in the middle, right? Yeah, for certain freedoms, but not too many at the same time. We don't want a liberated working class, for example. We still need certain workers to go back to work, a la Joe Manchin's philosophy. Real leftists don't embrace the rhetoric of patriotic nationalism, for example, because the modern nation state is practically indivisible from the emergence of capitalism. And many hardcore leftists don't agree with the ethics of capitalism because they see capitalism and democracy as irreconcilable. And the reason capitalism has a racism problem is because capitalism has strong Eurocentric origins, backed by centuries of colonialism and imperialism, both political and economic. So not only are we saying that things like policing are tied to capitalism because they're tied to the policing of protecting of private property, not only are we talking about how the modern nation state is indivisible from the emergence of capitalism, how the origins of capitalism are very much tied to the disenfranchisement, marginalization, and disenfranchisement, sorry about that, of peoples around the world in terms of colonial practices, settler colonialism specifically. And when we're talking about the Americas and imperialism, we're talking about something like the US-Mexico War and how the United States acquired half its territories. We're also talking about current day forms of neo-imperialism, for example, passing sanctions on nations like Cuba back when Cuba declared itself as communist back in the 1960s. So the question still remains of whether or not a leftist politics can call it. And I want to return to this, is me returning back to the fascist creep, right? And whether or not there can be a left fascism. The question still remains, can leftist politics become totalitarian, especially when nationalists are party-based? And the answer to that is obviously yes. And we saw that, for example, in places like the Soviet Union, which became more and more totalitarian the longer they held on to power, and in many ways had to start off by basically bombing other working class communities that were not necessarily following party lines, because the Soviet Union didn't see itself becoming a communist nation that would, quote unquote, be defined by a dictatorship of the proletariat if they didn't get rid of certain proletariat sectors first, which is, again, hard to reconcile in terms of the philosophy, but it absolutely happened. So yes, you can have a party or a nation that identifies itself as leftist suddenly become fascist, but it's not left fascism. That's not a thing. It's called totalitarianism, and that's no longer left, because leftists are not in favor of totalitarianism. This is when the leftist rebounds back to an extreme right rightist or right-wing form of governing, like what is happening in China. I'm so amazed that people think that China is a communist nation. Yes, China called itself communist as a communist party, but it's not practicing a communist ethos when it comes to the interest of its own working class. In fact, it's highly totalitarian. I think it's second maybe to the United States in terms of imprisoning people. It censors people. There are people have very little freedoms. It controls the narrative of what people can say and what can they protest and what they can't protest. So at the end of the day, even though China calls itself communist, it follows a totalitarian regime model, and therefore it's very difficult for it to be legitimately defined as a leftist politics or a nation that's following a leftist politics. It's very much totalitarian. So yeah, China's not necessarily following in the tradition of what Marx meant by a dictatorship of the proletariat. And it's not just like in the US, it's not really a functional representative democracy. China's not a functional communist nation. And just think of what's happening in this country in regards to democracy and voting rights. Voting rights keep getting more and more restrictive, and we still maintain the fact that we have a functional democracy, not a very functional one at the moment, highly dysfunctional and very, very unhealthy. And I think that's hard to argue against, especially considering the events of January 6th. So the convergence is possible, but when that happens, the left side of the duopoly gets left behind. No pun intended, sorry. And that so-called left rebounds to centrist or all the way to totalitarian, which is basically fascism of a different sort. So what's the answer to this? Well, it's the answer that people are saying right now on the ground in places like New York City, and places like Portland, and places like Minneapolis, and places like Los Angeles, even in places like, in states like Arizona, where you wouldn't necessarily think that people would be talking about this, at least not when I was growing up. People are talking about general strikes. People are talking about unionizing. People are going back to the model of worker empowerment because they have seen and felt, especially I think during the pandemic, really highlighted this. They have seen how the billionaire and millionaire class get away with literally fleecing working class people out of a livable life, right? It's people live a bare life and are making decisions around necessities like food versus medicine versus shelter, when they shouldn't be having to do that, when they're working more than 40 hours, in some cases 2 jobs, just to maintain a working class lifestyle that hardly qualifies as a lifestyle. It's bare minimum. So worker solidarity for many people, including myself, is the key out of this enslaving, unhealthy, dysfunctional impasse. And here's a link to an essay or article entitled "We Can Move Beyond Political Polarization Through a Working Class Economic Agenda." This is written by Karen Nussbaum, who is a co-founder of the women's labor organization 925 and the founding director of Working America. And I'm going to note that as a labor organizer, she's been very successful, but Nussbaum's net worth is also somewhere between $1.5 and $3 million total. So I think that's personally, I think that's kind of weird, but I'll read from her essay nonetheless, since the point is still valid. And by point, I mean the establishment of a clear working class economic agenda. So the essay starts with a good overview of the divides that I've been trying to outline in this episode, or at least the second part of this episode. Are working class voters in America polarized? It sure looks like it. In Virginia, a mother threatens to bring loaded weapons to her child's school to stop a mask mandate, and the new governor institutes a tip line to report any school official teaching something divisive. That's a culture war, by the way. It's not a class, but that's a culture war that divides people who belong to the same class. So you have people in the working class that seems divided, and that's Nussbaum's point. Seems like the working class is very divided right now. Here's an example: a mom threatens to bring a gun over a mask to the school where other neighbors and people that attend the same church, etc., are also attending. So it's not a class divide in this case; it's a culture divide within the same class. And the new governor institutes a tip line to report any school official teaching something divisive. Texas also has a tip line with cash rewards to anyone reporting an abortion or intent to get an abortion. Local election officials fear for their lives. Armed white supremacist militias are the biggest domestic terrorism threat facing the country, according to the U.S. Department of Justice. So that's the way that she is kind of outlining the divide within the working class in the United States. And if you notice, they're culture wars, right? It's someone's teaching CRT. Oh, someone's going to have an abortion in Texas. Oh, militias are white supremacists, and they're the biggest domestic terrorist threat that the country's currently facing. That is all true. But those are all symptoms, I would argue, and I think Nussbaum's going to make the argument as well as many other people have made. These are all symptoms of class warfare. This is what happens when people get indoctrinated into a culture war without understanding that they're being manipulated to maintain a class divide. So she briefly outlines some of these divides and then theorizes on the possibility of skip here. She briefly outlines the effects of divides next. Quote, a Carnegie Endowment for International Peace study points to the corrosive effects of polarization on politicians and institutions and finds these divides extend far beyond the corridors of power. As, quote, polarization at the mass level is pushing Americans across the country to divide themselves into distinct and mutually exclusive political camps. And these political camps, I would say, are more defined by culture wars, and they are defined by your position on class politics and, more importantly, the redistribution of wealth in this country. So she finally theorizes on the possibility of bridging the divides with worker solidarity. Quote, but we're not there yet. There are millions of working class Americans who worry more about paying the rent or getting a medical bill than what's on cable news. Many of them hold no strong allegiance to a political camp and are potentially persuadable voters. A recent Pew study identifies 15% of the public as, quote, stressed sideliners, and another 12% as, quote, ambivalent right. So the point of the article is to highlight the fact that workers can be unified under a working class economic agenda. The problem is our political system pretends to be democratic when in fact we have a duopoly that answers to economic interest over people's interest, which is why we still engage in environmental damage despite the obvious evidence that climate change is getting worse. We overfund law enforcement and the military and seem incapable of lowering healthcare costs for people, never mind establishing a free healthcare system that is paid for by taxing the wealthiest people at a fair tax rate. Quasi-corporatist state disallows for any of these things, though you will hear politicians making promises about all these issues during election campaigns, just like the mayor of Minneapolis did when he promised to prohibit no-knock warrants, and yet it still happened somehow. So even if the convergence model is bogus, which I think it is, if there is a convergence in this nation's politics, it's the convergence of a two-party system becoming a duopoly that answers to capitalist interests, pure and simple. That's why you won't get free community college for 2 years. That's why your student debt won't be canceled, even though your right to your right to an abortion might be at stake at this point, including your right to vote and your right to learn the truth about race in the United States. So, right, Texas and other states are following the same rule, if not making it even more extreme, right? They're infringing on women's reproductive rights. They are restricting and making it more difficult for people to vote. And they are trying to erase the truth about how the United States became the United States on the backs of indigenous peoples, on the backs of other nations like Mexico, and through the enslavement of African Americans, celebrating President's Day and George Washington, and failing to mention the fact that he also owned slaves, for example. This is just facts. These are facts. This should be taught. And the fact that people are not willing to teach it and are prohibiting other people from talking about it is how you get into propaganda. And this country learned a lot about propaganda during World War II from another country that was engaging in hardcore propaganda. We even imported some of those people to teach us how to be better propagandists. They weren't all scientists. Anyway, so that's why you won't get all those things that I just outlined. Now, that's an ironic twist on cancel culture, I think, is the fact that we're canceling truth about US history, we're canceling vote, we're canceling women's reproductive rights, and yet the right wing side of that horseshoe model is constantly complaining about cancel culture, and yet they're very quick to cancel a lot of things and not call it that. So most politicians don't want to talk about that version of cancel culture on the left or the right side of that horseshoe model. So just to wrap up this episode, if there is a convergence, it happens at a duopoly level, and it happens because of financial interest and the power that capitalism has on American politics and so-called democratic governance. At the end of the day, we see the power that big business has over just your average ordinary citizens. We see how the far right can emerge as an actual political entity, but a far left version of that would be something along the lines of a working class economic agenda consistently gets debunked and or sidelined by both parties. We know that the GOP is probably never going to go with that, but the fact that Democrats are also equally culpable in silencing the possibility of a working class economic agenda, of the possibility of entertaining something like defunding the police and redistributing that money into public programs that benefit local communities and perhaps will lessen the possibility of crime rates going up and might actually help crime rates go down. Those things are not discussed. We live in a police state, and we throw more money at the military and we throw more money at police as a way of dealing with issues that are actually emerging from the community and have everything to do with things like poverty, the stress of trying to make ends meet, and the stress of trying to maintain a healthy lifestyle in light of all these socioeconomic stressors. So we basically do have a convergence in this country between left and right when it comes to answering to the interests of the financier class, or to Wall Street, if you will. And we have very much a convergence of silencing what would be a far left political stance, which would be represented by the people, the same people that take to the streets to demand a living wage, the same people that strike as teachers, as healthcare workers, as factory workers at Kellogg's or Frito-Lay or Starbucks. These people represent your far left, and they're never going to be given political power under this duopoly. So long as people like Mitch McConnell runs the GOP, Nancy Pelosi runs the Democratic Party, and people like Biden are presidents, this is going to remain, if not intensify, in terms of a status quo. And so that'll only ensure that things do not necessarily get better, and if not get worse, as some of us think we're seeing right now. So yes, convergence is possible, but it's not left fascism. There's no such thing. When you have the left fascism, you call that totalitarianism, like in China, like in the Soviet Union. And what a real actual leftist movement in this country would look like would be a workers' movement that has a working class economic agenda and that benefits the majority of the population and that taxes the rich at a fair tax rate like the rest of us are paying. That is a democracy. That would be justice. But that is what this duopoly keeps this country from realizing as an actual lived alternative. So on that note, I will leave you with that. Tune in for the next episode. I hope to have a special guest, so you just won't hear me rant on some of these issues. So until then, stay frosty, watch your six, gente, y hasta luego. Thank you. Oh, and don't forget to please subscribe to future episodes if you enjoyed today's. Thanks.